The Night the Moon Cried Blood. Chapter 1. The Crimson Eclipse. It began on the last night of August, in the quiet town of Silverpine, where secrets festered in the soil and the air always carried the scent of pine and something older, something no one dared name. Teenagers gathered on the school's old football field to watch the rare celestial event, a full lunar eclipse. Blankets and snacks, laughter and whispered crushes. Silverpine's youth didn't yet understand that their world was about to tilt. Among them stood 16-year-old Ava Mercer, the kind of girl who noticed details others missed. She felt things too deeply, read too often, and walked like she didn't belong to the time she was born into. As the eclipse approached midnight, the air shifted. It became heavier, and not just with expectation. A sudden silence fell over the field. Crickets stopped chirping, the wind ceased, even the sound of leaves rustling vanished. Ava looked up. The moon, once pale and luminous, began to bleed. It wasn't red like science books said it would be. It was crimson, a deep throbbing color like fresh blood under glass. And as the shadow moved across it, shapes began to form. Not craters, not illusions, faces. Eyes, watching. Gasps rose from the crowd. Some laughed nervously, others stood, staring in horror. And then someone screamed. On the field, a boy named Casey fell to his knees, clutching his head. Blood dripped from his nose. His eyes rolled back as he whispered, "It's waking up. It sees us now." Chaos erupted. Phones stopped working, lights flickered, and above it all the moon pulsed. Once, twice, a heartbeat in the sky. Ava couldn't look away. And in that moment she knew this wasn't just a night of stars and shadows. It was a warning. The moon had cried blood, and Silverpine would never be the same again. Chapter 2. Shadows over Silverpine. The day after the eclipse, Silverpine didn't wake up the same. The town looked normal on the surface. The trees still swayed, cars still moved along the quiet roads, and Mr. Daly still rang the bell for first period at the high school. But something beneath it all had shifted. Like a breath had been drawn in, but not released. Ava sat in homeroom, staring out the window. The crimson moon still burned into her thoughts. No one talked about it, not seriously. Kids joked about it on social media, blaming a power surge, a prank, or a mass hallucination. But Ava knew better. So did Casey. He hadn't returned to school. By lunchtime, the rumors had grown teeth. Some said Casey was in a coma. Others claimed he'd run off into the woods and hadn't come back. Ava tried texting him again. Still no answer. Her stomach twisted. She walked home the long way, past the edge of Miller's farm where the woods grew thicker. As she turned a corner, she froze. There was something in the cornfield. A shape, tall, unmoving, just inside the first few rows. Ava squinted. It wasn't a scarecrow. It was too still, too solid. Her phone camera shook in her hand as she zoomed in. Nothing there. But when she looked again without the lens, the figure had taken a step forward. She ran. That night, the dreams came. Of trees bending toward her, of whispers in a language she didn't understand, of the moon, closer now, too close, its bleeding face covering the sky. She woke up screaming, and on her bedroom ceiling, written in faint red letters, was a message. "We're already here." Chapter 3. Whispers in the Field. Ava didn't go to school the next day. She claimed to be sick, but her mother didn't ask many questions. She seemed distracted too, staring at the television even though it wasn't turned on. Ava watched her for a long moment before retreating to her room. She couldn't stop thinking about the message on her ceiling. She had tried to scrub it off, but the red stain had sunk into the plaster. She hadn't shown anyone. She didn't want to. It felt personal. It felt like a mark, a warning meant only for her. The day passed in a blur. Time didn't feel real. Every ticking second stretched longer than it should, and every corner of the house felt too dark, even with the lights on. Ava paced, checked her phone, paced again, and then she made a decision. She was going back to the cornfield. It was dusk when she stepped onto Miller's farm, the sky a dull orange and purple bruise. The rows of corn looked taller than she remembered, like they had grown overnight. She hesitated at the edge. Then she stepped in. The air changed immediately. Warmer, heavier, dense, with a scent like rust and soil. The leaves brushed against her arms as she moved forward. She held her phone like a flashlight, its screen barely enough to light the way. About 10 rows in, the whispers began. They weren't words at first, just shushing sounds. But then her name, Ava. She spun around, no one there. "Ava, help us." It was coming from all directions, from the wind, from the soil beneath her feet. Her breath caught in her throat. Then she saw it. A clearing. At the center stood a scarecrow. But it wasn't straw. It was flesh. Its face was sewn shut, eyes blackened, arms stretched unnaturally wide, and around its feet the corn had turned red. Ava staggered back, heart pounding. As she did, the scarecrow's head tilted, just slightly, and a chorus of whispers erupted from the corn. They remember. They're coming. Chapter 4. The Bleeding Sky. The sky over Silverpine had always felt safe, predictable, even comforting. But ever since the eclipse, the atmosphere seemed wrong, off-kilter, as though the sky had developed a pulse. On the 4th day after the crimson eclipse, Ava woke to the sound of something tapping against her bedroom window. Not rain, something sharper, more deliberate. She pulled back the curtain to find streaks of red trailing down the glass. Too thick to be water. She gasped and stumbled back. The sky outside was a violent hue, an unnatural blend of deep maroon and purplish black. Clouds churned slowly, almost hesitantly, as if the sky itself was alive and unsure of what it was becoming. By the time she stepped outside, the entire town had gathered in silence. Neighbors, classmates, teachers, all standing in yards and streets, staring upward. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the birds had gone quiet. Ava spotted Mrs. Green from next door clutching a rosary, her lips moving in silent prayer. On the other side of the street, two toddlers cried while their mothers stared blankly at the sky, not noticing. The sun was nowhere to be seen. The moon, still red, hovered unnaturally low, like it had forgotten where it belonged. A single drop of something red fell from the sky. It hit Ava's cheek. She touched it and brought her fingers to her eyes. It wasn't rain. It was blood. And then the clouds cracked. A sound like a scream echoed across the sky, metallic, sharp, and full of rage. A deep split opened above Silverpine, like someone had torn a wound into the heavens. From it poured more red droplets, slow at first, then faster, until it was raining blood. Panic finally broke. Screams erupted. People ran for cover. Ava didn't move, because as the blood fell, she could see something inside the tear in the sky. Shapes, twisting, crawling, watching, and one of them looked back at her. It smiled. Chapter 5. Eyes in the Corners. The blood rain stopped sometime before dawn, but the red stains on the sidewalks and rooftops remained. No one came to clean them. No news crews arrived. The town was sealed in silence, as though the world outside had forgotten it existed. Ava spent the day inside, curtains drawn, lights dimmed. Her mother hadn't spoken a word since the sky split open. She simply sat at the kitchen table, eyes wide, hands trembling slightly whenever she blinked. Ava tried talking to her, but it was like trying to wake someone from a nightmare they'd accepted as real. As the sun began to set, though the sky never turned gold anymore, only shades of deep violet, Ava noticed something new. Movement. In the corners. It wasn't just shadows or tricks of light. This was different, real. The corner of the hallway where the baseboards met began to shimmer subtly, almost like heat rising from asphalt. She crouched down, heart pounding, and stared. Two eyes opened, round, wet, and too human. They blinked, once, twice, then vanished. She scrambled back and turned on every light in the house. She ran from corner to corner, searching, testing, touching. But they were gone. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, flashlight clutched in her hand. At 2:17 a.m., the hallway creaked. She turned her beam slowly. Nothing. Then, from the ceiling corner above the staircase, something whispered, "You see us now." She aimed the light up, and there they were again. Eyes blinking open across the ceiling, in every shadowed corner. Dozens watching. One began to weep. A slow, dark tear rolled down the wall like oil. Ava covered her mouth as a voice echoed through the house, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "We've always been here. You just stopped looking." Chapter 6. The Hollow Boy. The next morning, Ava woke with a start. Her flashlight had died in her hands and she couldn't remember when she'd finally drifted off. Her mother hadn't moved from her chair. The same teacup sat untouched in front of her, the same vacant look in her eyes. It wasn't until Ava went outside to check the mailbox that she saw him. A boy stood across the street. He was around her age, maybe younger. but there was something terribly wrong about him. He wore a thin, soaked white shirt and brown trousers caked with mud. His head was tilted slightly, as though listening to something Ava couldn't hear. He didn't blink, didn't move. She squinted. Was that Casey? No. This boy was thinner, his eyes darker, his posture too still. Then he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too slow. Ava took a step back. The boy took one forward. She turned and ran back inside, slamming the door behind her. She peeked through the curtain. He was gone. Later that day, she walked to the edge of Miller's farm again. The air was heavier there now. The corn husks drooped as though they were mourning. And just at the edge of the woods, she saw him again. This time, he was whispering to something Ava couldn't see. His lips moved without sound, and then he turned his head sharply, as if sensing her. Their eyes met. He raised a hand and pointed to the sky. The clouds above twisted slowly, forming a spiral. The light dimmed. Ava blinked, and the boy vanished. But carved into the tree beside her was a single word: fresh and dripping red. Hollow, and below it, etched in jagged strokes, was her name. Chapter 7. Blood on the Clock Tower. The clock tower in the center of Silverpine had stood for more than 100 years, its copper dome and iron bell a symbol of the town's quiet, measured rhythm. It was a place of announcements, parades, and once upon a time, high school dares. But in the days since the Crimson Eclipse, it had become something else entirely. The clock no longer ticked. Its hands were stuck at midnight, the precise moment the moon turned red. Ava made her way there alone. She couldn't explain why, only that each night her dreams pulled her closer to it. The whispering shadows in the corners had stopped murmuring her name and instead began chanting one word over and over. The town square was empty when she arrived. Dust blew across the brick road. The clock tower loomed above her, casting an impossible shadow that bent in the wrong direction. She stepped inside. The air was thick, damp. The stairwell spiraled upward, lit only by narrow slits of dull gray light. As she climbed, the temperature dropped. Her breath came in clouds. Midway up, the walls began to change. They were no longer stone, but something softer. Covered in symbols etched deep, scratched in with nails or bones. The spiral of the moon. Eyes with bleeding centers. Names. Her name. When she reached the top, the bell platform groaned. The massive bell hung still, but the air around it vibrated. And on the far side of the platform, someone stood. It was the hollow boy. He faced the bell, whispering into its mouth. As Ava approached, he turned slowly. His eyes were deeper now. Hollow, yes, but filled with the crimson light of the moon. In one hand he held a knife, in the other a pocket watch, broken and bleeding. He lifted the knife and pointed toward the town. Then, slowly, without sound, he carved a symbol into the side of the bell. As he did, blood poured from the metal like water. The bell began to toll. Once, then again. Each chime echoed through Silverpine like a scream. and the moon above pulsed with every ring. Chapter 8. The Veil Between. Ava didn't remember walking home from the clock tower. One moment she was staring at the hollow boy carving blood into the bell, and the next she was standing in her front yard, her shoes soaked with dew and something darker, stickier. She stood in the driveway, blinking at the faint dawn that struggled to break through the crimson haze. Something in her had shifted. The barrier between dreams and waking, between memory and vision, was thinning, and she wasn't sure she could trust what she saw anymore. Inside, her mother was still at the kitchen table, unmoving, the same cup of tea, the same look. Ava whispered her name, shook her shoulder. Nothing. She checked her pulse. Still alive, still warm, still gone. Ava backed away and stumbled to her room, where the mirror had fogged over from the inside. She wiped it clean and gasped. Her reflection was delayed, a fraction of a second too slow, and its eyes were red. She spun around, nothing there. Then she felt it. Not a breeze, not a touch, a presence, watching her from beneath her bed, behind the closet door, inside the mirror itself. And then she heard it, faint whispering again. Only this time, it was coming from behind the walls. She pressed her ear against the plaster. The voices weren't just speaking, they were chanting. The veil is thin, the door is open, she stands between. Ava gasped as the wall beneath her hands rippled like water. A single eye pressed out from beneath the paint, stared at her, and then disappeared. That night she dreamed of two worlds layered atop each other, one Silverpine and one darker, crueler, wrong. She walked through both at once, touching grass that turned to ash, reaching for doors that dissolved. And in the center of it all, under a sky that bled stars, was the hollow boy. He whispered, "This world is folding, and you are the crease." Chapter 9. Screams from the Well. The next morning, Ava found herself drawn to the woods beyond Miller's farm. Her dreams had shown her something, an image of an old stone well, half buried in weeds and choked by vines, sitting in a forgotten clearing. She had never seen it before, but the vision had been so vivid she could still smell the damp moss and hear the wind whistling through the hollow stones. She followed instinct more than memory, her boots crunching on brittle leaves and twigs as she crossed the thinning tree line. The air here was colder, sharper. The sun, or whatever light passed for it now, seemed to dim the closer she got. And then she saw it. The well stood just as it had in her dream, tilted slightly to one side, covered in ivy, a rotting wooden bucket hanging by a frayed rope. It was silent, still. But as Ava approached, a low sound began to rise. It wasn't wind. It was a voice, faint, echoing, crying. She crept closer and peered down into the darkness. At first there was nothing, just blackness, and the sound like soft, like someone sobbing from miles away. Then the cries sharpened into words. "Help me." Ava's heart raced. She leaned over the edge, careful not to slip, her breath caught. There were scratch marks on the stones inside, faint but there. Fingernails had tried to climb out, desperately, repeated. She reached for the bucket's rope, but it snapped the moment she touched it. The bucket crashed into the depths with a sickening echo that didn't sound like wood hitting stone. Then the screaming began. Raw, terrified, inhuman. It echoed up the well, growing louder, more urgent. Ava stumbled back, hands over her ears. The trees around the clearing began to bend inward, as if pulled by the scream. And from the darkness below, a new voice whispered, "You heard us, now we know where you are." Chapter 10. What the Moon Revealed. Ava stayed in bed the entire morning, her blankets pulled tight around her as if they could keep out the memories of the well. The scream still echoed in her ears, vibrating through her bones like a warning. But it was more than just sound. It had opened something in her, an understanding, or maybe just an awareness, of something vast and ancient watching them all. That night the moon emerged again from behind clouds, larger than ever before. Its red glow drenched Silverpine in a sickly, pulsing light, turning the town into a landscape of shadows and blood. But something had changed. For the first time since the eclipse, the moon, it spun, not fast, but slow. And as it turned, lines appeared, etched symbols glowing faintly across its surface. Spirals, runes, and faces, each flickering with a dark energy that felt both mesmerizing and terrifying. People across town came out of their homes, drawn toward the sky. Ava joined them. Her mother stood beside her now, no longer catatonic but whispering something under her breath. Words Ava couldn't quite understand. Her neighbors too were speaking, some in unison, some alone, all facing the moon. And then she saw it. Reflected in the window of a parked car, the moon showed her something it hadn't shown the others. A glimpse into something beyond the veil, a second Silverpine, decayed, lifeless and full of crawling shadows. She saw herself there, standing in the middle of the town square, staring at a burning tree where the clock tower should be. The reflection smiled at her. It mouthed a single word. So the wind howled, the moon pulsed, and all across Silverpine people began to scream, not in pain, but in awe. Because in that moment everyone finally saw it. The moon wasn't just watching. It was remembering. Chapter 11. The Pale Gathering. The next morning, Ava awoke to silence. Not the calm kind, but a hollow, expectant stillness that made her feel like the world was holding its breath. The air outside had turned a chalky white. No breeze, no birds, just a pale fog that pressed against the windows like it was trying to see in. She ventured outside slowly, each step crunching on brittle leaves that hadn't been there yesterday. The sky was a dull gray, as if the color had been drained from it overnight. And scattered across the streets, on every lawn and sidewalk, stood the people of Silverpine. They were dressed in white, thin gowns, some still in pajamas, others in robes, all barefoot, all silent. Their faces were blank, their eyes glassy. Some stood alone, others in small groups, but none spoke, none blinked. Ava's breath caught in her throat. She moved cautiously through the fog, whispering names. No one responded. Even her mother had joined them, standing still beneath the oak tree in their front yard, her lips barely moving as she mouthed something Ava couldn't hear. She followed the crowd as they slowly began to drift, all heading in the same direction, toward the center of town. The square was unrecognizable. Where the fountain once gurgled and pigeons gathered, now there was a wide ring of salt. Symbols carved into the concrete pulsed faintly beneath the fog. The townspeople gathered around the ring, forming a perfect circle. Then, from within the mist, the Hollow Boy emerged. He stood at the center of the ring, his arms lifted, his mouth opened, and though no sound came out, the fog vibrated. One by one, the people dropped to their knees. Ava stood at the edge, frozen. She could hear their whispers now, not from their mouths, but from the air itself. We gather in pale to be seen. We gather in silence to be chosen. And above them the moon pulsed once more, bathing the square in crimson light. Chapter 12. Don't look at the light. The light came not from the sun or the moon, but from something else entirely. It began as a soft pulse above the center of the town square, a trembling orb suspended in the air like a lantern held by invisible hands. The moment it appeared, the fog recoiled, peeling away from the light like burnt paper. Ava saw it first. Her eyes locked onto it before she could stop herself. It wasn't white. It wasn't red. It was colorless, like staring into something that had never been meant to be seen by human eyes. Her stomach flipped. Her vision swam. Then came the voice from the Hollow Boy. Don't look at the light. It echoed not from his mouth, but through the bones of everyone gathered. Too late. One by one, the townspeople turned their eyes toward the orb, and one by one, they changed. Their mouths fell open, slack, their eyes turned to glass, and then they smiled, wide, unblinking, and too still. Ava shielded her eyes and fell to the ground, pressing her palms against her ears. But even with her eyes closed, she could feel the light seeping in. It didn't illuminate, it infiltrated. She crawled through the dust, through the salt ring now smudged and broken, to where the Hollow Boy stood. He didn't look at her. He was focused on the light, trembling. It's not for them, he whispered. It's for you. Ava shook her head. I didn't ask for this. The Hollow Boy finally turned, and there was sorrow in his eyes. You were chosen when the moon bled. She opened her eyes for a fraction of a second and saw everything. The other Silverpine, the one layered over hers, a mirror world made of bone and shadow. She saw herself in that world, walking through ash and ruin. She saw the moon splitting open, not like paper, but like skin. And inside it, by thousands, watching. The light surged, Ava screamed, and everything went dark. Chapter 13, The One Who Waits. When Ava woke, she wasn't in her room. She wasn't anywhere she recognized. The world around her was pale and gray, not in color, but in feeling, as if someone had drained emotion from it. She stood on cracked ground, the sky above swirling with slow-moving clouds the color of old bone. Silverpine was there, but not. It was a reflection, a twisted version where buildings leaned too far, where shadows moved even without light. No people, no birds, just silence. She wandered down the empty streets calling for anyone, her mother, Casey, even the hollow boy, but no one answered. Yet she wasn't alone. She could feel it. The eyes watching from windows, the breath just behind her ears. In the center of town, where the fountain once was, stood a figure. Not the hollow boy. Taller, hooded, wrapped in black cloth that moved like smoke. No face, just void. The one who waits. She approached, her body moving on instinct, though every step felt like walking through thick air. "You're not supposed to be here," it said without speaking. "Where is everyone?" Ava asked. "They are with me," it replied. "Or they will be." "What do you want?" It raised a hand, not threatening, just pointing toward the sky. A crack was forming again. The same tear from before, but this time bigger, widening, and through it came tendrils of red light and shifting shapes, slithering down like veins. "You opened the gate," the figure said. "You are the gate." Ava backed away, but her feet sank into the ground. Roots, not from trees, but from herself. Her body was tethering, anchoring to this place. "I'm not one of you," she shouted. The figure tilted its hood. "Not yet." Then the scream returned, not from the well, but from the sky. And Ava looked up to see a second moon forming, black and hollow, with a mouth that opened wide. Wait. Chapter 14. The hour it all turned. Time collapsed that night. There were no clocks, no bells, no phones that worked, but Ava could feel it, an hour that didn't exist before, one wedged between the final tick of midnight and the first breath of morning, a secret hour, one meant only for her. She stood alone in the mirror Silverpine, surrounded by hollow homes and flickering lights that glowed without source. The sky above her bled, not red this time, but a dark blue-black ichor, rippling as if made of water and ash. The second moon, its mouth agape, teeth like stone spires, hung lower now. Breathe. The hollow boy waited at the edge of the town square. He didn't speak, but his presence told her everything. This was it, the final choice, the moment she could either resist or become. Ava took a step forward and the ground beneath her groaned. Symbols bloomed where her feet touched, burning faintly gold. The buildings pulsed, their walls expanding and contracting like lungs. And then the people of Silverpine appeared. Not flesh, not shadow, something in between. They formed a wide ring around her, eyes blank, mouths slightly open, every face she had ever known. Her mother, her classmates, Casey, even the scarecrow now stood among them. They began to chant. She is the fold, she is the gate, she is the hour reborn. The one who waits stepped from the tear in the sky, descending slowly. It didn't walk. It unraveled. Ava's pulse thudded. Her chest burned. The air thickened around her until she could barely move. The hollow boy held out a hand. "This hour does not belong to them, it belongs to you." "What happens if I take it?" she asked, voice cracking. "Then we end, or begin, or both." The second moon howled, and Ava, with her whole body trembling, reached for the hollow boy's hand. The instant she touched him, time shattered, and the hour turned. Chapter 15. When the moon wept red. The sky broke open. Ava stood at the center of what was once Silverpine, now transformed into a surreal echo of itself. Streets twisted into spirals, rooftops bent skyward like fingers grasping for something just out of reach. The air was thick with the scent of rust and smoke, and overhead the second moon, black, massive, alive, hovered like a wound in the heavens. It wept. Not tears, not rain, blood. Thick red droplets fell in slow motion, suspended mid-air before splashing silently across the ground, painting the town in a pulsing crimson wash. The people of Silverpine, those who remained, stood still, eyes wide, arms outstretched, mouths open in silent praise. Their skin glowed faintly, as if lit from within by something old, something alien. The hollow boy stood beside her, his hand still holding hers. "This is the reckoning," he said quietly. "The moment you choose." "Choose what?" Ava asked, though she already knew. To close the gate, or to become it. The one who waits floated above the town, robes billowing like smoke, eyes a void that swallowed light. It spoke without moving. Let it in, let it through. Let her bloom. Ava felt it then, the raw power surging through her veins. The memories of 1,000 lives, not her own. The voices of the veil echoing within her skull. Every dream, every whisper, every omen, leading to this. The blood from the moon touched her skin. It didn't burn, it calmed, and with it came clarity. She looked at her town, at her mother, at Casey, at the hollow boy whose empty eyes still carried something gentle. "I'm not the gate," she whispered. "I'm the key." And then she let go. The ground erupted in light. A scream pierced the sky, not of pain, but release. The second moon split in half, dissolving into ash and stardust. The one who waits vanished in a burst of wind, and Ava fell to her knees. The people of Silverpine collapsed. The blood rain stopped. The real moon reappeared, white, soft, still, and the town slowly began to breathe again. Ava looked up, exhausted, changed. The hollow boy was gone, but deep within her something lingered. A whisper, a memory, a promise. We are watching still.